Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm joined by Yves Engler, the author of the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. Thank you so much for joining us, Yves Engler.
Thanks for having me.
Now, when I look at your book, the first thought is, well, Canada is a peacemaker. Canada is known as the peacemaker in the world for close to 60 years now. We think of Canada as the one who brokers peace in places of conflict. How does your study of our history reflect this, and where are the discrepancies?
It's mythology. It's a mythology that's designed to lull the Canadian population into trusting the politicians on foreign policy questions. It's not based in substance analysis, as we see today with the Trudeau government continuing policies of pro-U.S., pro-corporate foreign policy, and that, if you look back a century pre the sort of Lester Pearson's peacekeeping times, that has been overwhelmingly what has driven Canadian foreign policy, which is a mix of supporting empire, historically British, today American, and supporting Canadian corporate interests abroad. Look at almost all regions of the world, and you'll find the general pattern holds up.
In many ways, we are living in a world where we're mired with crisis. We're told we have an economic crisis, an economic collapse, and many places of the world are being felt at different levels. Neoliberalism has become the water we swim in. We no longer question the fact that unions are being made to disappear, that unionizing it's in some places made illegal. So how do we reconcile our view of government and our responsibility to co-create the conditions that lead to having governments that reflect our desire, our commitment to peaceful coexistence with other places in the world?
Well, I mean, I think it's a responsibility of everyone who is living in a place or has some ability to impact the policies of a place. So in case of people living in Canada, the Canadian government primarily, to say yes or no. Do we support this policy? Do we oppose this policy? Canada, while there's major inequalities, while there's lots of ways in which power structures deter dissent and make life difficult for those who challenge the policies that are being proposed by elite sectors, it is still a relatively free society. And there's people have a fair bit of capacity to express their dissent. Yes, there's different ways in which you get marginalized, but for the most part, people are generally not killed. People are generally not thrown in jail or other horrific things done to them. So that makes it so we have quite a bit of I think responsibility to say no, not in our name. No, we don't want our government to be trying to destabilize and overthrow an elected government in Venezuela. No, we don't want our government to be doing everything it can to back Canadian mining companies that are abusing indigenous communities in many parts of the world. No, we don't want our government to be selling billions of dollars in weapons to a reactionary monarchy in Saudi Arabia. No, we don't want our government to be seeking to undermine democratic movement in Honduras, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that there's lots of room for the population to express itself. But it gets down to really the question of work and just people coming together, figuring out democratic spaces where people are free to express their opinions about political affairs, and of course things like unions and and student unions, labor unions, student unions, social movements need to be built and rebuilt. It's to a large extent a question of the work and effort to do so.
What has been the role of the Canadian government in the Trump administration with regards to Venezuela? Because for many Latin Americans, Venezuela has been this beacon of possibilities. We've seen significant changes in the population, in their health, in the, lifting of a great number of people from extreme poverty. So for Latin Americans, the example of Venezuela has been of a democratic process that has created what we call a beautiful revolution, a revolution that did not take having, half of the population dying to create change. And the government that came in place under Hugo Chavez was a government that was very responsive to the needs of Venezuelan, nationalizing some of the resources, making programs that help the poor, that increase housing, increase health. So clearly, this was a very welcoming change for Latin Americans. However, it's not so well received by countries like the U.S., where they felt their monopolies were being threatened as Venezuela went to nationalize the resources. Can we talk a little bit about this relationship that, in some ways, I guess power means right. And so those with military power, economic power, sometimes feel they have the right to declare how other countries, should govern and operate their affairs.
Yeah, I mean, the Harper government was very hostile to the Venezuelan government. During the Harper government, the Venezuelan government was stronger. Things were going well. Price of oil was high. Chavez obviously was still alive for the most part, most of that time, the Harper government. And so the Harper government was rhetorically hostile to Venezuela's government, pursued some policies in terms of supporting opposition groups. But since the last couple years, actually under Trudeau, and the fact that the Americans and the Venezuelan elite have very much seen an opportunity, they've seen a weakness in the government's economic downturn, and they've really pushed their advantage. The Trudeau government has really jumped on that process and has brought in sanctions against two different rounds of sanctions against Venezuelan officials. Chrystia Freeland, Canada's foreign minister, has repeatedly attacked Venezuelan government for alleged human rights violations, for purported lack of democracy. They've obviously done this at the same time when they're supportive of the government in Brazil, the Temer government in Brazil that wasn't even elected, and they've also done this while they're supportive of the Juan Orlando Hernandez government in Honduras, won a very dubious election. So their policy has been to try to isolate, to weaken the Venezuelan government, while Donald Trump is talking about invading Venezuela, while former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was openly calling for the military to overthrow the elected Maduro government. So Trudeau has really has continued this anti-Venezuelan policy and actually ramped it up with some very concrete measures in terms of bringing in sanctions. And of course, people need to remember that sanctions contravene unilateral sanctions contravene international law. They've pursued policies against Venezuela at the Organization of American States. The former Canadian ambassador in Caracas, when he left in the summer, he did an interview with the Ottawa Citizen, which I've quoted in a few articles, where he just said openly that basically that the Canadian government was backing the opposition and providing media platforms for the opposition, providing internet platforms for the opposition, and they couch it all, of course, in human rights language and democracy language. But in practice, what they're doing is supporting a very a reactionary, elitist opposition that would like to see Venezuela return to the old times when they ran things. I would say Venezuela is quite a clear example of Ottawa aligning with the hard right American imperialism and with the Canadian corporate interests, and just many examples of Canadian corporate interests over the years that have been hostile to the transformation process taking place in Venezuela.
Today, we also see the continuous call for increased intervention by the opposition. Now, those of us who lived in Latin America have experienced firsthand what dictatorships of the past have meant for us in terms of the bloodshed, in terms of the dirty wars of the 80s that we experienced. And as you rightly point out, as in the case of Honduras, the military coup that that basically took out Manuel Zelaya and put on this coup government that has now been that was only acknowledged by the U.S. and the rest of Latin America had denounced the inclusion of this government. Now, in contrast, right, we have a democratically elected government in Venezuela where the population, the vast majority of the population still supported. I mean, not in every country, not everybody agrees. In Canada, there are special interests that would prefer to have a conservative government, and there are other areas of the population that would prefer to have a more socialist or democratic government that cares about sustaining healthcare, free education, increased wages, those kinds of things that are signals of how well a society it's doing in terms of equality, in terms of access, in terms of creating a path for the growth of all its population, not just its business sector of it or its economic engines. So can we talk a little bit about how does this awareness take form in terms of the kinds of actions that you're inviting the population to take in defense of our values of democratic rule of egalitarian principles, right, of peace and justice?
Well, I mean, my personal political viewpoint is that we live in a society that's way too unequal, a world that's way too unequal, that the small few have own way too much and have way too much political power, or too much economic power and political power, that the governments resort to violence way too quickly. There's way too much resources devoted to militarism, and that collectively the world's population, overwhelming majority of the world's population, would do better by pursuing policies that overcome the imbalances of political and economic power in the world, that devote less resources to war and militarism, that devote more resources to education, to health sector, that devote less resources to extractivism, to fossil fuels, to ecologically damaging endeavors that our governments, our economic system pursues, and that devotes more time and energy to people finding themselves through art, through education, through friendships, family, and so people work less, consume less, but work less, right? So have more time to explore different things. These kind of transformations, there's differences of opinion. There's differences of opinion within Canadian society, differences of opinion within Venezuelan society, differences of opinion within every society about how much attention and resources and priority should be given to, one sector of political or economic life or another sector of political economic life. I think that we're widely out of balance in our society and in much of the world, and the reason we're widely out of balance from what the core human interests are is because, to a large extent, the corporate structure, capitalism, prioritizes a certain type of development, if you want to call it that, of resource extraction, of consumption, of alienation in terms of people, doing jobs that they feel totally alienated by. They're often not very socially useful work, and doing it under very oppressive conditions. To me, there's a need to push forward on more humanistic, socialistic fronts, and that will be better for everyone collectively. Obviously, it's not; these are tough struggles, and they are struggles. But people need to remember that victories, the women's right to vote in Canada didn't just fall from the sky. It came because there was struggle, people fighting for it. Improvements in Indigenous rights didn't just fall from the sky. In fact, the policy has been genocidal, has been to wipe out, and to the extent that policy has not been successful, it's because of Indigenous resistance. Workers' rights, the fact that we do have weekends, that's because labor unions for decades, individuals and came together for decades collectively to fight for those rights. So I think that the process also of the social change, people finding themselves in struggling for social change is an important component. I think people enjoy being part of something bigger than themselves and being part of a process of seeing themselves as part of a collective, of seeing themselves as part of a world, of a collective humanity, even globally speaking. And that yes, these are struggles, and the term struggle is there for a good reason because they are difficult, there are battles, but there is also a sort of realization that people find in that process on a strictly personal level of being part of something that's right, that's just, and that's bigger than themselves, and that's something that it's good for their families, good for their children, good for their grandparents, et cetera, et cetera.
I love that you point out that, a lot of the policies that we see put in place, like this idea that free trade is something that's free from harm. As we're, in Canada, we are so focused on what Venezuela is doing, and we know very little of what our government is proposing in terms of this free trade negotiations with the U.S. We are very aware of the battles between provinces. Alberta trying to force British Columbia to take an increased amount of tar sands oil, which is very dangerous for the coast in terms of the way that they want to increase the number of pipelines, which are in the past have been known to have multiple spills, not just in case it happens, it's always when. And the areas that these pipelines are going to travel are very precarious for British Columbia. And yet, we're so focused on what Venezuela is doing. What should we be asking about, what our government is doing in our name in this trade agreements negotiations? What are we exposed to that will threaten not only our ability to govern our own resources, to take care of our own ecosystems and wildlife, our oceans, our water? What are some of the concerns that we need to be taking care of at home?
Well, I mean, as you pointed out, there's many different concerns, and obviously in BC right now, fighting against Kinder Morgan pipeline and the fact that the bitumen has to stay in the ground. That has to be front and center of these discussions. That the climate emergency, climate disturbances mean we have to move off of fossil fuels, and the bitumen in Alberta is some of the dirtiest oil there is in the world, and building pipelines is about locking in a process of expanding, not reducing. We need to be reducing, expanding consumption of fossil fuels, and particularly one of the dirtiest forms. In terms of NAFTA and what's in NAFTA, I mean, the whole process of signing so-called free trade agreements has been a process of making life easier for foreign investors, for multinational corporations, empowering multinational corporations so that they can move factories to places where they can pay people less, so they can threaten unions that don't succumb to their demands and threaten them to move shop. It's also about, if you get into the particulars of the agreements, there's the side components or the chapters that give special rights to foreign investors to sue. That's something the Canadian government, not just in NAFTA, but has been pursuing in all these so-called foreign investment promotion protection agreements and free trade agreements Canada signed with different countries throughout Latin America, Colombia, Peru. They all have these so-called Chapter 11, which is in NAFTA, which allows foreign companies to sue governments if they're unhappy, if they feel like they've been mistreated and lost profits. They're able to sue in these international tribunals that are sort of secretive, and they just basically empower multinational corporations. So that's part of what's going on with the NAFTA negotiations with Trump. I mean, there's so much to be hostile and critical of Donald Trump on. The one area where I think there's maybe some positive is his hostility towards NAFTA, and I think it would be a good thing if NAFTA was simply was ripped up. I don't think that there would be certain economic sectors in Canada that in the short and medium term might have some difficulties, but in the medium longer term, from the perspective of most Canadians, from the perspective of lessening the dominance of corporate power in our lives, getting rid of NAFTA would be a good thing. And so we shouldn't. I don't think that the progressive forces should be, just because Donald Trump is against something, therefore we're for it. And I think that goes long-standing progressive policy in this country has been to be opposed to so-called free trade agreements because what they do at their core, they're about empowering corporations. Mm-hmm. And about weakening democracy, right? Weakening, when a community opposes a fracking in its community, and then they get sued by a multinational corporation because they're not allowing that company to extract natural gases. In one instance, in one lawsuit under NAFTA has taken place against Canada. So I think that the free trade negotiations, and also Canada is involved in free trade negotiations with Mercosur, the South American bloc right now, and those are questions that haven't gotten much attention. Mercosur's the right-wing governments of Mercosur have kicked out the Venezuelan government, which was previously part of the agreement, and now Canada is involved in negotiating, potentially signing, joining Mercosur with the right-wing, some right-wing South American governments. So those are policies that, again, they're being driven by corporate interests, and as you point out, the importance to the population is not really being properly discussed.
In Latin America, most of Canadian agreements have involved increase in mining, increase in the deterioration of water resources for the populations, increase in monoculture, and this also means more hunger for the populations of countries like El Salvador, Honduras. In many ways, returning to our own basic needs of protecting the soil that we grow our food from, the water that we drink, the air that we breathe. I feel that's really where our efforts need to be invested. And like you said, a lot of these free trade agreements are just about increasing the profits for corporations and international movement of money. We call it neoliberalism, but really has been a liberalization of the financial sector, a liberalization of laws in favor of terrible injustice against the workers. But it has not liberated us because people are working more and we see fewer jobs as a result of all this globalization. We see more poverty, and we're seeing a lot more people being displaced by ecological disasters. What inspires you that we can't move our society to, towards ideals of more recognition of one another, recognizing that if we want clean water and fresh water in Canada to drink and safe food to eat, that, we ought to want that for other parts of the world, for people in other places.
Yeah, I think what inspires me is seeing people struggle in much more difficult conditions than people have for the most part in Canada. I mean, if you take a look at history and what's moved the world out of slavery, for instance, was to a large extent, or an important part of that, was the Haitian Revolution, where people were living in conditions that are so much more oppressive, and their ability, the difficultness of overcoming those conditions is so much greater than anything in the vicinity of what most people in Canada live in. So people fighting for advancement. I'm of the opinion that on a very personal level of my paying attention to international affairs and my looking at Canada's role in the world from an internationalist perspective, is a result of decades of struggle by people before me that have opened progressive opinion within Canada to more internationalist perspective. If you go back and you look at, as bad as many things are today with Canadian foreign policy, what Canada did in Korea in the early 1950s was much worse, and there was very little dissent. And what's happened over the past 50 years, and it's not a completely trajectory is not completely positive, but the broad trajectory is improvement, where people have become more internationalist, less racist, and that's because of struggles like the anti-nuclear weapons struggles of going back to after World War II, to the fight against the war in Vietnam, to Central America solidarity struggles in the 70s and 80s, to opposition to the coup in Chile, to Haiti solidarity. That's where I became politicized, is Haiti, or in terms of Canadian foreign policy, is the Haiti solidarity struggle after the 2004 coup in Haiti, and our building this pan-Canadian Canada-Haiti Action Network to challenge that. So to me, I find inspiration from those struggles and from a reading of history that shows that so many of the things that we just take for granted today, those are basically because just sort of common people came together with a bit of spare time and with very little personal benefit to be had, fought for those struggles because they believed in it, because they thought that it was just right for women to be able to vote. A look at history suggests not that it was going to be easy to get towards a real internationalism and an equal world. It's not going to be easy, of course, but that it's possible for sure.
Thank you so much for being with us today. How can people access your book?
Online, you can go to Yves Engler, YVESENGLER.com for most of my articles and stuff about my books and whatnot.
Thank you again for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We've come to the end of our show, Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an internationally syndicated weekly program made available through campus and community stations and available out to the world at www.latinwavesmedia.com. Visit Latin Waves Media to hear previous shows, to access resources, or support our efforts towards social change via community project engagement. Thank you and bye for now.